Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending our panel on IoT security regulations this afternoon. Today's panel will be moderated by Robert Morges. Robert?
Thanks, Tom. I'll echo what Tom just said and thank everyone for joining us. My name is Rob Morges. I am a senior director with the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And I am very pleased to be joined by such an esteemed group of people for this panel on IoT security regulation. Just do a quick round of intros, then I'm going to moderate a conversation for half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll leave the back end of that for questions and answer from the audience. So please do populate the question bank using the platform, and we'll be sure to get to as many of those as we possibly can. I'm going to start with Harley Geiger, who is the Director of Public Policy at Rapid7, where he leads the company's policy engagement on cybersecurity, encryption, computer crime, and digital trade issues. Prior to Rapid7, Harley was Advocacy Director at CDT and Senior Legislative Counsel for Representative Lofgren of California. Geiger is an attorney and CIPP US certified. Next, we have Kat Megas. She is the Commercial Adoption Lead for Trusted Identities Group and Program Manager for the Cybersecurity Internet of Things program at NIST. She's the author of several notable NIST publications on IoT security, including, and especially pertinent for today, NISTer 8259, which is on core baseline cybersecurity capabilities for IoT devices. And then finally, last but not least, we have Matthew Eggers, who is VP for Cybersecurity Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he leads a cybersecurity working group which develops and advocates for the Chamber's cyber policies, including on IoT. Before Congress, the administration, and industry. In addition to IoT and cyber issues such as chemical security, biosecurity, and emerging security threats round out Matt's portfolio, which I'm sure we'll grill him about later on today. Like I said, in terms of the run of show, we're going to have a conversation here for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to questions and answer from the audience. Kat, I'm going to turn to you to kick things off with a very simple baseline question. And if you can just sort of give us the high-level overview, what is IoT? Is there an accepted definition? Is there a real difference between IoT, conventional IT? Where does operational technology fit into all of this?
Great. Thanks, Rob. Every conversation seems to start like this. What is IoT? And to give a little bit of background, that's where we started about 3 years ago when we stood up the program at NIST, and we said, hey, what is the definition of IoT? We looked out there, we probably found over 50 definitions of IoT. So being NIST, we said, and we asked our stakeholders, would it be helpful if NIST would take on developing a definition for IoT? And this will kind of show what a geek I am, but if you know XKCD and the cartoons, there was a cartoon around standards where they said, oh, this is great. We have 16 or 14 competing standards, right? We will create the standard to rule them all, and all you end up with is just one more. So as we started to work on our IoT security program, we asked our stakeholders and said, do we really need to nail this down in order to actually be able to talk about IoT risks, and how to mitigate those risks? And the broad consensus really was, it wasn't really important at that time. We did go through and try to identify kind of some common behavior of IoT and IoT devices to kind of put our arms around it. But I would say there's no one definition to rule them all. We think that's okay. Everybody creates a definition that suits their purpose in order to scope their work. And kind of when it comes to OT, I mean, I think from our perspective, I hear OT, I think SCADA systems, I think industrial control systems. Cyber physical systems have been around for a very long time, and everybody likes to act like IoT is new. I think people who are familiar with the ICS era will say, we've been looking at this for a while now. I think what's new is that with connectivity, they're starting to integrate more of these common IP-based protocols that you see in traditional IT systems, which are making them susceptible to the same risks and threats that we've traditionally only focused on IT.
That's great. And that actually is a great segue into my first question for Harley, which is about those risks and threats and vulnerabilities that we see in the IoT ecosystem. Harley, you come obviously from sort of the cybersecurity company, so you have a very good view on what's going on out there in the ecosystem. What are some of the most common security flaws that we're seeing today when it comes to IoT? What are the potential ramifications of those flaws? Like, what could we see happening? And in addition to that, where do you see the sort of threat or vulnerability landscape of the Internet of Things evolving over the next, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Harley, I'm going to have to ask you to unmute.
No matter how you can do this all day and still get caught with the mute button. Just thank you, Rob, and thanks to HtC Capital and ICS Village for having us. So common security vulnerabilities that we see, they're kind of all over the map, but some of the most common that we see are at this point pretty well known. Weak, hard-coded, shared credentials, lack of security for data in transit, data in storage, insufficient update practices, having insecure ecosystem interfaces like mobile security or mobile applications that have more access privileges than necessary, lack of device management. There's a few good lists out there as well on IoT vulnerabilities. We think that OWASP has done a good job with their top 10. In terms of ramifications, botnets are a big one. We see a lot of device vulnerabilities. When they hit IoT technology, it commonly gets incorporated into attacks that ultimately create botnets, but other ramifications are data compromise, so compromise of the data that is on the device or pivoting from the device to other networks. You asked how the landscape might shift in coming years. So obviously there's going to be a lot more IoT, and this will cross paths with a lot more networks as the IoT is carried physically from place to place, work and home, consumer and enterprise environments. And so the sheer quantity of devices and this volume of new exposure are going to create more opportunities for attacks. We think that the weakest points in consumer IoT, at least, will continue to be the end user for bad passwords, incorrect deployment, unsecured networks. And this is a challenge to the vendor to build in better security from the start, right? To keep consumers engaged in their own security and to have processes in place to mitigate damage when there is an attack or an incident. We also see a continued convergence of IoT and conventional IT products. Eventually, it'll all just be computers, and the distinction between IoT and conventional IT will just continue to erode. But that is a bit more of a policy consideration than a landscape of the vulnerabilities in the future.
That's brilliant. And I think that's a great sort of hopping off point for what is really the crux of what we're going to talk about today, which is in the title, right? Is it time for IoT regulation? And I think, what we've learned here, IoT is not new per cat. It's IT really that just interacts with the physical world. It's nothing really new. We've had industrial control systems and operational technology forever. The threat landscape is evolving, and obviously because that IT is interacting with the physical world, we have potential new ramifications or potential different ramifications than just your sort of hack and leak, although in addition to those ramifications, obviously access to other parts of the network, the weakest point in the network might be the ingress point for an attacker. But that's great. So Matt, I'm going to turn to you and sort of to kick things off on the topic of governing IoT security and whether it is time for IoT regulation. Matt, what sorts of options from the Chamber's perspective, from your perspective, should policymakers be considering to incentivize better security in the IoT ecosystem? As Harley sort of outlined with the threat space and the vulnerability space, we obviously have the status quo where we do seem vulnerable. So what are the options for policymakers here?
I think they've got some good options. I think first, Rob, thanks for moderating and others for inviting me to participate. I was at first I was halted, stunned in the difference between your moderator picture and your growth. I'm jealous. I can't do the beard thing, but I've tried.
I think that photo's probably got to be like 5 years old. So
yeah. One thing I would say is there's probably a good, I think there's probably more similarity in views with some significant probably departures in a lot of things. I think one of the things we've been trying to think about, whether it's a business cyber plan or Internet of Things, or, and I'll take your pick, is to try to balance through, let's say, negotiation, compromise, things that hopefully haven't gone out of style, between, let's say, a regulatory approach on the one hand and what I would call protection on the other. I think what we are thinking about, and just to, take for example your IoT bill that you guys have developed thoughtfully, you guys have posted on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission website, is it looks at things like regulation, but really through a process where groups like NIST are featured, stakeholders like the Chamber, Rapid7, others are involved. I'll say more, but I think we're trying to look at how we can better balance and meet a kind of a suite of interests, if you will.
That's brilliant, and I think one of the options that's often floated, by industry and sometimes by folks in a position to implement or institute legislation or regulation is this notion of self-regulation enhancing the broader IoT sort of IoT marketplace, the IoT ecosystem. Harley, what promise does self-regulation have here, and is it enhancing the overall security of the marketplace?
So yes, our position is that self-regulation is enhancing the security of the broader IoT marketplace, and it does play a role. Our opinion is that it is currently not enhancing it enough. From our perspective, brand reputation is the biggest driving force right now around enhancing IoT security. And to their credit, big brand name IoT device vendors in the United States do put in a lot of work to enhance security. We have seen some brand name companies, even when they leverage commodity like white label products in their offerings, will sometimes hire external resources to test the product security before incorporating it into their product and putting it out on the market. So this is not a thing where the entire marketplace is behaving in a singular fashion. However, there is a lot of IoT out there. It's not just the brand names that we all know. And white labeled products from non-US sources like China will continue to be a problem unless regulation makes them comply with baseline security for their exports to the United States. It's possible that consumer awareness can help shore up some of that. We do make consumers care enough about security that they will change their purchasing decisions, but we think that this is unlikely to be an effective driver by itself. Self-regulation for IoT has been around for quite a while. Government agencies, trade groups, standards bodies have all been releasing quite a lot of guidance and best practices on how to mitigate IoT security risks. And in our opinion, regulators should be pretty skeptical of any claim that we need to wait for additional standards, additional best practices in order to have an expectation that IoT devices can meet basic security features.
If I can, Harley, I just want to pull on one thread that you introduced there. And I think, this notion of consumer behavior and self-regulation are really, really closely intertwined, right? Because one of the ways that we will see more self-regulation is if the market demands more self-regulation or more security, right? One of the conversations that we had on the Solarium Commission, and I think NIST has been having this conversation as well, and Harley, I think you and I have even had this conversation, is what are some of the ways that we can influence consumer behavior short of regulation when we talk about sort of market transparency initiatives and the like? I'll kick that to Harley, but Kat and Matt, if you have thoughts on that as well, I'd open it up.
Yeah. So the two ways that are sort of the elephants in the room are certification and I don't want to say labeling. That's become kind of a dirty word because people associate it with like a physical sticker on a gadget, but rather just some sort of transparency that the vendor puts out to the consumer prior to the point of purchase about some of the basic security features. And these things we think can be a useful element of IoT security. Consumers absolutely do play a role in this, but we're at this point it's not. It doesn't have the best track record in security. There are some, I think, useful examples elsewhere in industry. Energy SAR is frequently brought up, but there are others. The organic food label, right? The nutrition label in food. Like there's labels everywhere, and consumers use them all the time as shorthand to help influence their buying decisions. I buy ketchup that doesn't have high fructose corn syrup. But we also recognize that something like that, like a label, for example, we do not want it to give consumers a false sense of security. If that transparency focuses on some of the really basic IoT security problems, like a reusable password, it does not necessarily cover things that are other vulnerabilities in the device or vulnerabilities in the ecosystem around the IoT device, which is a crucial point. And of course, one of the problems with defining IoT to begin with. So we think it's a useful element to keep in the mix, but it's not going to do the job on its own.
Yeah. Before we move off of that topic, I want to give Matt and Kat, starting with Kat, the opportunity to say anything they want on transparency and the role of the consumer here as well.
Yeah. I think Harley, you kind of touched on a lot of the points I probably would have touched on. I think it's one of the tools in the toolbox. It's just not the only tool in the toolbox. There is a lot of talk now about conformity assessments and all the different ranges that might take. I think generally when we look at it in this, we say, cybersecurity, that is a tough area to put a stamp on a device and say, yeah, this device is good to go, because it's only at a point in time. It's only under a certain specific configuration. I think this is going to be a really tough nut to crack. And I also think there's a conversation to be had about, yes, a baseline is good. At the same time, though, we don't want to just drive everything to the floor. We want the market to innovate. We want, manufacturers to feel that they own the risk management process and for them to define what they want to do in their devices. So I think there's a lot to balance here. So kind of going back, the consumers are one piece of it. But yeah, and then the shared responsibility as well. The consumers of the devices, whether they're industrial consumers or federal government consumers, or whether they are consumers at home, they have a role to play. So again, is the device secure out of the box? Probably not. So, what does it really mean to pull on that thread and say this meets a certain threshold?
Matt, any thoughts on that?
Sure, thanks. No, I think there's a lot that I would agree with there, in the sense that I think if you think about some of the language in one of the previous panel discussions with I think Paul and Stuart and Megan Brown and Megan Stiefel, one of the points was, hey, what are we trying to solve for? And I think, at least for us, many of us, some more technical, some more policy focused, I think what we're trying to do is to kind of exist in a space where we've got policymakers and industry trying to work together to up the game for devices, right? So I think Kat rightly mentioned the core baseline. Hats off to NIST for working with industry, including the chamber, on developing a baseline. And I think a lot of times we think about regulation in a device maker, but we've also got members that want to be bringing technology, including devices, into their enterprise that are more secure. So we're very sensitive to that. I think one of the things that we like about the CSC proposal is that it more or less says to industry, you work with NIST and you point to existing standards, or it allows for innovation. The NISTer, what is it, 8259, could be a item that a company or an organization could select from. I think what I would call a cafeteria plan of options. So not only would you have a core baseline for all, let's say, new devices, but it would allow for different segments of the IoT community to specialize. Now, how would that work? And this is something we're still thinking through, but a potential kind of a win-win here would be certain predictability, certainty, liability protections, let's say protections from private rights of action, but you would definitely have a role for the Federal Trade Commission to play. That's kind of new, at least for us to be thinking about, but there's a balancing there. We'd also want to be looking at, I think if I didn't mention it, preemption. I think one of the things we've learned is let's try to have kind of a level kind of playing field, not only nationally, but globally, to reduce a lot of the fragmentation that we're seeing. And I think that's something that we're trying to be mindful of.
Yeah, Matt, and you mentioned the issue of preemption. You mentioned sort of the international landscape right now when it comes to regulation or legislation, as it were. Can you run us through sort of what you see from the chamber perspective as the status quo or the current state of regulation, of legislation, and of other government initiatives around IoT security, both sort of in the US at the state level, but also sort of internationally, right? We know that the EU is thinking about this. We know that the UK is thinking about this.
The EU, UK, the Australians have some proposals in place. I would say probably what we're tracking most closely, there's IoT legislation that just passed the House on suspension, quite handily, if you will, for non-legislative practitioners. I think the bill's got a good chance of passing the Senate, what's known as UC. I think it's a bill that I would give a lot of credit to the bill writers for working with the chamber and others since, gosh, probably first surfaced at least for us about 3 years ago, almost to the date. I think it's focused on the federal procurement space. One of the things we'd like to see is something that would add on preemption and also then look at the inclusion of liability protections, right? So, for example, the CSC bill looks at addressing private rights of action and so forth. And again, what I'm coming back to is a better balancing of interests. So policymakers, let's say, would get their regulatory win. Industry would get certainty and certain kinds of safeguards or protections. And I think, each side is going to have to kind of persuade its own team, if you will, that that's the right way to go. I can't convince business that regulation is the right thing. I can't tell folks that maybe have questions about preemption that that's the right thing, but folks that want, let's say, regulation could say, hey, preemption is the right thing. And on our side, I would say, hey, if you look at the balancing between potentially regulation and some safeguards, everybody may get more. And I say may because I think it's still early, but it's a possibility for good governance.
Harley, what are some things that you're hoping to see from this sort of ecosystem of legislation, regulation, and governance around IoT?
So we're aligned with the chamber on the preemption issue. And if I can just to completely dodge your question for a moment, and but just to underscore what we see as the need for federal action on this. Right now, there really hasn't been a lot, right? So the bill that Matt described as passing the House yesterday, our read of it is that it is very good. It focuses pretty narrowly on a subset of federal procurement, and that's it. Now, some agencies, notably the FDA, have put out some rules on IoT device security within their jurisdiction. And then, of course, there's the extremely good work from NIST, as well as other sort of voluntary best practices from agencies, but that's not regulation, right? By far, right now, the most sort of bold and cross-cutting work is being done by entities other than the federal government. It's being done by US states like California and Oregon. It's being done by some of the countries that Matt had mentioned, Australia, the UK, the EU, I think Malaysia as well. So several of countries are moving into the IoT security space, but not Congress, like not the federal government. I just want to underscore that because I don't think that there's any real reason for us to cede that sort of leadership, especially as it relates to our own industry, an industry where we can thrive. There's at this point a lot of reports, homegrown reports that identify IoT security as a pretty pressing cybersecurity issue. So we should get on it. In terms of preemption, we also think that it is important to avoid a regulatory fragmentation that you would see if each state started adopting its own set of laws. We can see that same sort of fragmentation starting to happen overseas with the different countries that we had mentioned. There are different ways to craft how this theoretical regulation ought to look, but we do think that there ought to be the consistency and alignment ought to be one of the hallmarks of it. And alignment not just with across states, but also alignment with industry best practices. There's a ton of material already to draw from. We really don't have to reinvent the wheel on this.
And I want to get to the contents in a second of sort of what we think Congress should be doing. But before we do that, I think you raised an interesting point, right? And that is this notion of having the right information going into it. right? And I'm always loath, and I think, you know, policymakers can be guilty of this, of us putting the cart before the horse, right? Springing to action before we're sure that we have, you know, at least good enough information to guide us in the right direction for smart policymaking. And Kat, I would turn to you for this one, and not for the policy question, but for the question of whether, you know, from where you sit, do we have the right security guidance? Do we have the right voluntary standards? Do we have the right best practices already established through your work, the work of organizations like ISO and others?
Yeah. So again, pointing back to where we started, being NIST, that was the first thing we did, is we said, okay, let's do an inventory of what are the international standards already out there before we do the XKCD, you know, cartoon and develop yet something new. And we published it. It's NIST IR 8200. The actual body of 8200 is not that big, but the appendix that actually has the inventory of all the standards, it's 100 pages. So I recommend it if you have a sleepless night. So to Harley's point, there is so much already out there that's applicable. I think the message that we heard is there are a couple of gaps, and there are some small gaps, and we're seeing a lot of good work. I kind of am trying to make some notes here. There's some work going on medical devices, and there's some work going on in IEEE. There's a lot of work in ICS going on on a standard. There's the international standards work that's going on. We even have some U.S. national standards that are emerging. CTA, they're kind of publishing some work around this. So we're seeing some very specific. I think the challenge eventually is going to be, if you're a manufacturer, maybe pointing more to kind of the small and medium businesses, and you're just getting into this area, where do you start? So I kind of see that likely is going to be kind of the next wave that's going to come. It's going to be, how do I demonstrate conformity? You know, what are the criteria for that? There's all this guidance out there. And then I think the second piece is going to be, okay, give me some sort of framework as a manufacturer that will actually help me think through what out of all of this actually applies to me.
Yeah, and that raises another, I mean, really interesting point. And this is one of the things that I would say the Solarium staff struggled with when we were putting together our draft bill, and that is this notion of a one size fits all, right? We talk a lot about baselines, right? And maybe there are some baselines that we can say these are ubiquitous, they fit across the entire IoT ecosystem, but the notion of one size fits all, I'm not sure, Harley or Matt or Kat, if you have thoughts on whether that's a viable way forward.
Harley, I'll let you go, and then I've got some thoughts.
No, we don't think that one size fits all is the right way forward. Did you think I was going to say that it was, Matt? Just curious.
No, I was going to let you kind of run with it, and then I'll follow up.
So no, I think that for a regulation to be really effective, there does have to be an element of security by design, right? There does have to be some sort of element of security controls, and but those security controls should be both risk-based and actionable. So they should be, you know, specific enough that the vendor, whoever's trying to comply, is able to actually execute on them. But they should be reflective of the risks that their particular situation, their product, their environment is actually going to be facing. And that's not going to be one size fits all. That being said, because many risks are shared in common across, you know, consumers, for example, separate from the factory floor, separate from the enterprise space, you will see, I think, a lot of security controls ultimately be repeated when you have a similarity of deployment. But those different deployments, again, like enterprise or operational technology, they may face very different risks. So the key is it being risk-based.
I think that's exactly right. Risk-based approaches are key. You know, what's interesting is I think we've got the ingredients. I think, you know, NIST, just for example, pointing to Kat and her colleagues' work at NIST, they've been doing a lot over the last couple of years. I think we've got what we more or less need, right? Between groups like NIST, CSDE, CTIA, and others that have some IoT-related things. So, for example, right, the Kelly Hurd or the Warner Gardner bill, right? The things that they call out, in addition to pointing to kind of an international or consensus-based approach to standards or frameworks or guidelines, you know, they're looking at things like secure development, identity management, patching. IoT devices should be patchable, right? Configuration management. The NISTer has, I think, a couple more items, including, I think, looking at, hey, can a device tell you its cyber state of distress? So, there's at least a couple, when I say couple, about 4 to 6 things that most folks would say, hey, these ought to be baked in, right, from the get-go. I think CSDE has probably a longer list. And I think the question is, how do we want to leverage policy to really take the next step forward? And so I think for many businesses, I think we want to point to those approaches, among others, right? And then look at what kind of body would enforce that and under what conditions. I think then you could have a business saying, hey, I will build to this knowing that I won't have certain suits brought against me. I can build nationally. I don't have to comply, let's say, with a California approach or a federal approach. There's one consistent approach. And then hopefully, too, what that would do is send a message to our international partners, hey, we've kind of set the tone, and hopefully others will follow. So folks in the ecosystem here, whether you're a maker or a service provider, there's more certainty and consistency. So if we were talking to folks on the Hill, we would say, hey, that's something we would want to keep plugging away at.
That's okay. That's great. Kat, did you want to add anything there?
Nope, I'm
okay.
Pretty good with everything that was covered.
Excellent. So just want to remind folks that we will move to Q&A here in sort of 10, 15 minutes. So please do populate that question bank. But before we do that, I want to give you all a chance to expand a little bit on something that we beat around the bush with a little bit here. And that is what we actually want to see, the contents, the who, the what, right, of regulation or governance action moving forward. Harley, I'll start with you. For policymakers attempting to regulate, legislate, or otherwise govern, what is the approach that you recommend?
So 2 possible approaches. One is to empower federal agencies to issue regulations for the devices within their jurisdiction. So for example, FDA or FAA for drones, FDA for medical devices, they've already done some of that work. NHTSA for cars, CPSC for product safety. I mean, we have these agencies in place for a reason. They cover a certain area of the consumer market. Just because there's a computer inside the product doesn't mean that it has to go to some other law entirely. But that is also a viable approach. You could have just one federal law for IoT and have that cover the vast majority of the items that have computers in them that consumers use. Either way, the contents of them we think ought to be aligned. It ought to be preemptive of state regulation. It ought to have risk-based security controls, like we mentioned, but recognizing that despite being risk-based, there will be a lot of commonality. Like there's not really a good reason why IoT devices should have a universal or shared credential. Have it be aligned with industry standards and best practices, so we are avoiding a fragmented landscape. Ideally, like the House bill that passed recently on federal procurement, we would like to see a nod towards vulnerability disclosure policies. Consumers with these devices will encounter vulnerabilities, and we'd like to see some sort of mechanism, some sort of incentive for them to be able to pass on their vulnerability disclosures to the manufacturer. And if possible, maybe it's a report or an exploration, but looking into that transparency piece for consumers. What is the effects? What is the viability of coming up with a scheme for the vendor passing on to consumers, for example, whether the device can receive security updates and for how long, right? Something limited, and whether or not that provides that false sense of security and whether it actually would change market practices. But the big key is going to be those risk-based security controls that are hopefully aligned with industry standards and best practices.
Matt, I'll flip it to you for essentially the same question. For policymakers, many of whom we might have listening to us right now, attempting to regulate or legislate, what's the approach?
I think there's a kernel, I think, that's embodied in the bills that are before Congress now, and I think even more so with the CSC model, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission bill, which, you know, for those that are watching from home, flip to page 15 of the doc that's on the website. But I would say process is what is the word that's key, right? So I think what we want is for industry stakeholders, folks on this panel, to be able to identify those risk-based, if you will, standards, frameworks, guidance that could be applicable to a number of IoT makers and users, and say, hey, we've chosen these, or these are the options, but there's always room for, you know, getting rid of the old and bringing in the new. And stakeholders would identify those. I think with respect to the role of the FTC wouldn't write those specific regs or the requirements, let's say, I guess, probably like they do with, let's say, the safeguards rule. But they would say, hey, this is big picture, overarching structure. This is what you're going to be, we're going to enforce against. I think it would be something to consider. Since we've probably had too much agreement here, I would maybe disagree with Harley and say we probably wouldn't want to empower individual entities to be setting specific requirements. I think we would probably want to try to do that through the process and have companies with different kinds of IoT devices select something that's tailored to their own kind of segment of the ecosystem. So maybe just to pick some devices, a drone or a medical device, or a device that someone would wear, let's say, in an athletic event, or if that's even covered, or in an agricultural setting, that kind of thing. Those are my thoughts, at least with respect to that question, Rob.
That's great. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Harley. And Kat, for you, slightly different spin on that question, or completely different question, frankly. More about challenges that you foresee going forward in really reaching towards a more secure IoT ecosystem.
Yeah, you're right. It is kind of a different question, and when I listened to Harley talk earlier on, kind of about kind of where he sees the trends going with respect to vulnerabilities, I do think 5G, and as we see 5G roll out, and as we see devices have more and more of their own embedded connectivity, I think a lot of the work that we're looking at right now is we put a lot of security controls on the network. We use the network as kind of a way to kind of manage the risk associated with IoT devices. I think that's going to become more and more a challenge. It's going to be harder. You're going to be acquiring devices. You're going to be bringing them into your premises. You're going to be deploying them, but they have their own connectivity. They don't even need to touch your network. So I kind of see that as an upcoming challenge. I do think that you know, we talk a lot about fragmentation. And when right now we're working on what we're calling the federal kind of adaptation of the core baseline. The core baseline was meant to apply, you know, across as much across the board as possible. Understanding for the federal government, we will have some special requirements because of the nature of the federal government and what we do, and that's part of what we're working on now. But we started with the core to avoid fragmentation because we recognize fragmentation is bad for the market. It makes it more difficult for the U.S. federal government to actually procure devices if we start fragmenting too far. But I'm seeing a lot, and this was touched on as well, on the international kind of landscape. It is, you know, it's quite the list. You know, Japan just recently, their MICT just recently put their own regulation into effect for any device that attaches to the telecommunications infrastructure. So we're already seeing a lot of fragmentation. There are some international standards that are being worked on, but that's a lengthy process. Just last week, actually, I had a lot of 3 a.m. calls last week in participating in this international standards meeting, but we are moving the standard to committee draft. So it's going to start going out to national bodies, but that's still a long way off. So in the meantime, You know, we're seeing a lot of fragmentation internationally, and I think that's going to be a challenge for us.
Bless you for those 3 a.m. phone calls, and I think that's a perfect sort of summation, I think, of what we've heard from Harley and Matt as well about some of the challenges they foresee coming up here. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from the audience. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat function there. I'll read them out and point them at this esteemed panel. First one, I think I would turn to Matt and Harley for this one. What's the right agency in the US to lead the way here? Harley, you touched on this a little bit in your answer already. There's sort of 2 options, but I think, you know, the elephant in the room that you didn't quite mention is if there's going to be a single approach to this, it's probably going to involve the FTC, as Matt mentioned. If that's the right answer to this question, does the FTC have the capacity? What needs to be done there to make this meaningful and appropriate, frankly?
So, it's multi-part, right? So yes, the FTC is the right lead agency. No, they don't have capacity. And capacity for the FTC is a problem, not just in IoT security, but in other spaces. You hear this come up frequently in the conversation about national privacy legislation, for example. And it is a real problem. Even if you went with one of the approaches that I had mentioned, right, where you empower some of the sectoral regulators to take up IoT security within their jurisdiction, you're still going to have devices, probably a lot of devices, like your basic consumer device, that is not covered by a sectoral regulator, except when it comes to safety. And that should fall to the FTC. So no matter which way you do it, I think the FTC needs to be heavily involved from the start. And Matt, you know, I agree with you. I take your point, but it does make it a bit more complex, at least, if you start involving other sectoral regulators in the IoT security conversation. But there's still, you know, if we look to the future and just think that, you know, most things are going to have computers. They already do have computers. It seems I sort of struggle with this idea that that NHTSA will cover everything in the car except for the security of the computer. That has to go to the Federal Trade Commission, right? And you know, and you can do the same thing, right, for drones. I mean, the FAA covers, you know, zealously covers safety for drones. But you know, do we then say, well, no, the FAA has to cede the security of the computer within the drone to the Federal Trade Commission? I'm not sure that is, you know, an approach that is future-proof and one that, you know, frankly is fair to the FTC given their capacity constraints. But it could be done. Either one can be done.
Fair point. I think it's something that we're going to wrestle with, like other approaches on cyber, probably for some time. I think if, Rob, to your question, what agency do we want to see involved? Commerce, NIST. I think we want those folks to be kind of on the playing field. Frankly, in terms of budgets, capacity, we would love to see Congress plus up what they do from a funding standpoint, so we can do more with NIST. We don't always agree, but we always have good discussions, good outcomes. I do think that probably what I would hear from a lot of members is they would find themselves in a position if there's multiple agencies regulating, almost like it's a microcosm of the challenges that we would have, where maybe we have a federal procurement bill, we've got California with its approach, then we've got countries with its approach. I would hear folks say, hey, let's just kind of winnow the number of inputs. We want to get it right, but maybe winnow the number of inputs. I think that's what I would likely hear.
Yeah, for the record, Robert, I thought you were asking like what would be the sort of like the lead regulator, but I definitely agree with Matt that Commerce and NIST should be involved. I mean, I think NIST is going to be, it is already indispensable to this conversation. Absolutely.
You have to say that because I'm here, right?
I say when you're not here too.
Everyone here is happy for a plug for NIST to get a little bit more funding and a little more resourcing. I think most people in this space acknowledge that NIST does great and important work. I think it's really interesting, Harley, that, you know, this sector-based approach, or this sector regulator-based approach is I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? You have certain sector-specific expertise in that regulator that's going to be able to tailor that regulation better to that sector's product. It's almost, though, like we need, I don't know, something like a cybersecurity forum of independent and executive branch regulators to really streamline efforts across those different sector regulators. I say that tongue-in-cheek because that's a thing that has existed in the past. It hasn't really fulfilled its mandate, but that's very interesting.
Well, absolutely. And Matt's point about having fragmentation is a very good one. And if I didn't make it clear, like I guess I didn't make it clear, but the regulators, I mean, there should be as much consistency as possible across what they do. It ought to be a coordinated action, not something where the regulator can come up with something that is completely outlandish compared to another regulator in a similar spot. But there will probably be some sectoral differences. And Rob, to your point, like they will be better able to accommodate that.
Matt, hop in there. I know you want to.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. One of the kind of ideas we've talked about is what I would call kind of the cafeteria plan. So I think the past administration and this administration has looked at regulatory harmonization. It's really difficult for a number of reasons, right? But leaving that aside, the difficulty aspects and how far those have gone, I think with the so-called cafeteria plan, what I mean by is, so let's say a potential law could point to a number of options, or better, I think more accurate, Rob, with the CSC bill is the process would select from among a number of options in the menu, right? So you could grab your carbs, proteins, what have you, and fats, of course, and you choose from those. And I think that in some ways is harmonization in reverse. And so one of the things we're trying to do is, whether it's IoT or in other spaces like, for those of you that have worked with us or talked with us on the Ohio approach to data breach, data security, they kind of try to have that balanced approach between a program with protections. And in that, there's a cafeteria plan of industry recognized standards and regulations. So I think that's a good model.
Excellent. I'm going to move on from that one on to the second question that we've got from the audience here, and that is around resources that you would point Hill staff or other policymakers towards on this topic. Kat, I'll kick that one to you to start, and then Harley followed by Matt.
Unfortunately, I was always taught not to toot my own horn, but I unfortunately I'll have to.
Yeah.
I'll have to. I think we have a lot of great resources at NIST, and we talk a lot about this core baseline work, but I do want to plug all the work that we're doing in the NCCOE, which is the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and we have projects in the NCCOE, and we're publishing implementation guides looking at areas like telehealth and how do you secure devices used in telehealth that are in a home setting. So we have a lot of great resources in the NCCOE. I kind of am trying to embrace a more digestible way to consume some of our 100-page guidance and documents. So we're putting more and more online kind of videos that are kind of, here's the highlights you need to know, so you don't actually have to read the documents. So, part of my job as the program manager is to maintain the single focus point for all of this information. So if you do Google the NIST IoT Cybersecurity Program there, I keep an inventory of all the resources that we have related to this area. But, I think start with NIST IR 8228 and NIST IR 8259, which has been talked about a lot, is kind of a good place to start.
Harley?
Yeah. I'd say that exact thing, Rob. I would say the NISTer 8259. There's two parts. I would pay particular attention to the core baseline. I think if there's something that's kind of a beacon, if you will, a lighthouse in the rough waters, it's that. The Council to Secure the Digital Economy report. They had kind of a companion to that. I would commend work by CTA, US Telecom, others to do that, to develop that. I would also say, hey, just from a comparison standpoint, look at the two the House Bill HR 1668 and the Senate Bill S 734, just to get your bearings, and then maybe third or fourth, your CSC draft bill. I think if you put all those things on a table and you read them all, I think you've got probably 90+% of what you need to fashion a bill. And then again, built around kind of a balancing of regulation with protection. And we haven't really agreed to anything yet, but I think that's something we're trying to consider as something that could be a win-win for a number of parties.
Harley, anything to add there?
I agree with the resources that were identified. I mean, if I was in communication with a Hill staffer or a policymaker, I would probably send three things. I would send 8259, probably 8259A, the IoT device cybersecurity capability core baseline, and then the Council to Secure the Digital Economy companion, which is a concise 80 pages. And then third, I would send that policymaker, to toot my own horn for a moment, my testimony from an April 30th, 2019 hearing on securing IoT. We put a lot into that. It includes the common vulnerabilities that we see and some of our recommendations on what to do. And so, between the three, I think that is an excellent starting point.
That is all fantastic, and I think I would agree wholeheartely with all those recommendations. We have about 9 minutes left, and I want to end on a question, sort of 2 minutes each. And this one's new to you, so I apologize. I didn't prep you for this one. But how do you think the shape of this discussion will have changed 5 years from now? What are the technological changes that are coming down the pike that might raise new regulatory issues, and where do you see this particular topic evolving to? Start with Kat, and then we'll go Harley and Matt.
Oh, wow. Okay. I don't think that fast on my feet anymore. So where do I think this conversation is going to be 5 years from now? I do think, and it's been touched on a couple of times, and I think it was Harley that said it, are we really going to be talking about Internet of Things, or is it just going to be everything, really? I think there's some, myths for a very long time thought about the Internet of Things as a kind of a buzzword. And we struggled a lot with that when we kind of set up the program. And honestly, it really is becoming the Internet of everything. So are we really going to have a conversation to talk about these special devices? I don't think so. I think it's going to get subsumed into the larger discussion on cybersecurity. I think I mentioned and I touched on, I think the advent of 5G and this idea of embedded devices and everything having connectivity. I think we had a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was we had somebody speaking from DoD, and they said, you can no longer take an approach where you're saying, I'm going to use micro-segmentation or I'm going to segment the network, because everything you procure nowadays, everything you buy, it has an implied connectivity, and in order for it to function, it has to have that connectivity. So I do think the world's going to be slightly different in 5 years, but I think, like many things in IT, we're just going to be regurgitating it and repackaging it and talking about it in a different way.
Harley?
Completely agree with Kat that the convergence of conventional IT and IoT will accelerate. They're really, the Internet of Things is going to be a term that has its moment now, I think, and it's going to pass, and it'll just be computers. The computers in IoT devices are general computers. They're just getting more sophisticated to match what we consider to be conventional IT. And you see this in every discussion about how to define IoT, where sometimes in legislation, it'll just say excluding conventional IT with no explanation as to why, but they have to include that in there because conventional IT would otherwise fit the definition of IoT. And then second, I think the United States is at a crossroads. Other countries are well into the discussion about their own national legislation on IoT security. We can either lead on this, or the conversation 5 years from now will be, how do we reconcile all of these different regulations out there on IoT security, and we don't have one for ourselves, and it's going to be a mess for our domestic industry.
Matt, over to you.
Yeah, I think I can't say I disagree with much of that. I would say we're going to likely be in a pretty similar place. I think in 5 years' time quickly goes by. It's not clear what the kind of the policy and political landscape will look like. I think IoT is something that is was kind of not artificially, but every now and then you get a certain kind of item, a technology in kind of the policy political space that gets particular attention, and then it just kind of takes on a life of its own. I'd like to think that in 5 years we will have developed or further advanced something that will balance a number of stakeholder interests, right? So rather than just saying, hey, we're going to look at how much we regulate or how little, we look at how we balance a number of interests. And I think a lot of folks here, let's say on this panel and elsewhere, would say, hey, we've all gotten more. We don't love everything in a bill, but we've gotten more of what we need. That hopefully will set a tone globally, because I think folks do want to have the U.S. kind of point to what might be good policy and go that route, and then continue to adapt. The last thing I'd probably note is, we talk about IoT, but I also want to be thinking about how the legislation or any kind of effort in the space fits into how enterprises are managing their cyber programs generally in terms of bringing in, let's say, IoT. Fixing IoT alone won't solve our cyber problems. We still need partnerships, information sharing, any potential nation state or non-state actor attacks against an IoT device or the underlying system. I think we still need more work done on how we deal with that. So yes, IoT itself, I think there's a role for some legislation, but also if you kind of wrap it around an overall structure, I think we're going to still be generally similar to where we are now, I think in 5 years.
That's fantastic. Kat, yeah, jump in.
I just want to add one thing. I don't know if we have a penny jar amongst this panel, but nobody has said the word AI yet. But I do think the convergence of IoT, and as we see AI and we see more ubiquity of AI, I do think we're going to see the stakes getting raised with respect to kind of the risks currently associated with IoT, right? As we start looking at big data and AI and IoT, and how vulnerability of one is actually going to have a network effect and impact across the ecosystem.
An excellent point as well. So with the last couple of minutes here, I'll just quickly wrap up by saying thank you to Matt, Harley, and Kat for what I think was an excellent conversation. Thank you to the audience for listening in. I think, the question that prompted this panel was, is it time for IoT security regulation? And I think the general feeling of this panel is that, yes, we are at a point right now where we're ready to at least advance that conversation. What does it need? It needs to be risk-based, needs to be preemptive. It needs to set some baselines. It needs to be aligned with standards and best practices, of which we have many. And I think one of the points that Matt made and Harley made laid on there is a good one, and that is that if we don't in the United States, we risk falling behind and having to play catch up in the future. So I'll leave you with that. And once again, thank the panelists and the audience for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank
See you,
you.
Harley. See you, Kat.